Hello, I'm Rachel from Douentza Garden in Ireland and Happy New Year. As you may know, I love to visit gardens of all sorts. It's wonderful to see what others have achieved and to take away ideas for my own space. Well, last summer I had the opportunity to fulfill a long-standing ambition, which was to visit the gardens of Cornwall. Now, Cornwall, it's not a million miles away from me. It is, in fact, in the southwestern tip of the UK, Ireland's nearest neighbour. You may well ask why I haven't been before. Well, it's hard to answer that. So, what's the draw to Cornwall Gardens? Well, Cornwall is renowned for its balmy weather and its impressive array of historically and botanically important gardens where they grow an array of subtropical plants. Today, I'm looking forward to sharing my summer trip with you, talking about and showing you the 11 amazing Cornish gardens I visited in the course of a week. So, let's get on with the video. I think winter is a great time to look back on the summer and whet our gardening appetites for the coming year. For this reason, I'm happy to share with you the fabulous Cornish gardens I saw last summer. If you're planning your own visit, a great starting point is the website called The Great Gardens of Cornwall. As usual, I'll link in my video description to any sites mentioned. The website has information about 13 of Cornwall's most important gardens. There are others, though, not mentioned on this website, and I will talk about some of those that I've visited in today's video. You probably won't get to visit all 13 of the gardens on the Great Gardens of Cornwall website, even if you stay a week in Cornwall, as some only open in spring and others are only open at specific times. I saw 8 of the 13. You really need to plan your trip in advance. You need to pay for accommodation, obviously, which is expensive, and you probably need to hire a car. Driving isn't so bad though. I'm a reluctant driver when I go abroad, but I would drive in Cornwall. Anyway, in this video, I'm going to lead you through the 11 gardens I visited in Cornwall in the order that I visited them. I have loads of positive things to say about the majority of these gardens, but there are a few negatives too. So, before we begin, let's talk about the climate in Cornwall. Cornwall has cloudy skies, cool winters, cool summers, and rain all year round. Annual rainfall is about 1,000 millimetres, that's 39 inches, and more on higher ground. The summer average maximum temperature is 22 degrees centigrade, that's 72 Fahrenheit, but only 18 degrees centigrade or 64 Fahrenheit in the southwest and the Scilly Isles. In winter, Cornwall experiences an average minimum of 1 degree centigrade, that's 34 Fahrenheit, and 5 degrees centigrade or 41 Fahrenheit in the balmy southwest and the Scilly Isles. These temperatures allow Cornish gardeners to grow a range of subtropical plants, so expect to see lots of tree ferns, palms, gingers, and giant green leaves. We arrived in Cornwall on a Wednesday, collected our hired car at the airport and headed to Lamorran Garden, which was supposedly a 37-minute drive from the airport. The skies were blue. We stopped for lunch on the way at the Near Country House Hotel. We sat on the veranda overlooking the beach and felt like we were in an Enid Blyton novel. The place was gorgeous, the staff incredibly friendly and helpful, and every bite of the food was simply delicious. It was delightful. I remember thinking to myself, if ever I win the lottery, I'll bring my whole family to stay there for a week. We headed on to the Lamorran Gardens in the best of moods. The Lamorran garden is a beautiful subtropical garden of just 4 acres or 1.6 hectares in size that dates from the 1980s. It's very much an intimate garden created in the mould of Mediterranean or Italian gardens. It has many statues, ornaments, temples, archways and follies, softened by leafy green planting. The garden is on an incline, so you spend time journeying downwards. Each area or scene is carefully hidden from view until you properly turn the corner, so the garden gives the impression of having a multitude of hidden spaces and tucked away nooks and crannies that you might have missed. It is an informal, romantic, terraced garden with curving paths and occasional reveals of the sea that truly do make the garden feel as if you're on the continent. Water is very present, both as a backdrop to the garden, but also with running water featured in the many pools and streams at different levels. Lamorran Gardens has over 200 palm trees from 35 different species or varieties and an impressive tree fern collection. The tree ferns not only include Dicksonia but also the more tender Cyathea. Before visiting the garden, I'd seen posts on Instagram of Lamorran's impressive black tree fern unfurling one of its fronds. It didn't disappoint, being even more impressive in real life than in the Instagram photos. The black tree fern is the tallest of the New Zealand tree ferns. This plant has a prehistoric grandeur. I believe Lamorran has 2 black tree ferns and that the garden's specific microclimate has given them the advantage over some other Cornish gardens of being able to grow this beauty. I was lucky enough to chat briefly with the head gardener and then more extensively with the owner, who shared some great information and gave me some pointers on other great gardens that I shouldn't miss if I liked this one. I loved Lamorran Gardens and it was a really positive start to the tour. The second day of my visit, Thursday, started early as I'd booked a gardening tour of the Minack Theatre right down at the tip of Cornwall, half an hour beyond Penzance. Yes, Penzance, where the pirates come from. The Minack Theatre is a functioning theatre in the most dramatic of settings. It's carved out of the cliffs and overlooks the sea. Plays and theatrical pieces are regularly performed here, and while I was visiting the gardens, I was lucky enough to catch a performance. The surrounding garden dates from the late 1990s and contains exotic planting woven through the upper areas of the theatre. The garden is now under the care of the RHS gold medalists Claire Batten and Jeff Rowe, experts in the cultivation of succulents, proteas and other exotic species. They have developed the area into a dramatic show garden worthy of the setting. Jeff conducted the tour that I attended. The garden is very small and there are lots of steps. In some areas, it has had to take second place to the access paths as plants should not cascade out over them, impeding theatre goers from getting about. Gardening, quite literally on the edge, which was the title of the gardening talk I attended, faces certain specific challenges at Minack. Plants need to contend with exposure, erosion, the wind and salt spray from the sea. Despite all this, the gardens managed to showcase numerous specimen plants and quite a bit of colour. The colour is provided by the daisy-like flowers of Lampranthus, Delosperma and Drosanthemum, which are all hardy here. Each bed in the garden is inscribed with the name of a Shakespeare character, as a nod to the theatrical context. The glorious backdrop of a turquoise sea enhances all.
They're meant to be hard of wearing, great
Our next port of call was a garden that I had been advised not to miss. It's the Tremenheere Sculpture Gardens. Now, I just want to say that the names of a lot of the gardens in Cornwall begin with the prefix tre. Apparently this means town or settlement in the Cornish language. Cornish is the ancient Celtic language of Cornwall, one that became extinct as a living language at the end of the 18th century, but was subsequently revived. Unfortunately, I'll no doubt butcher the pronunciation of many of the names of the great gardens in this video, so I'm happy to be corrected by anyone in the know. Tremenheere Sculpture Gardens is 22 acres or 9 hectares in size and dates from 1997. It has a dramatic landscape with exotic and subtropical planting providing the backdrop to contemplative and inspiring art by internationally renowned artists. There are woods and a stream interwoven with an evolving programme of contemporary artwork. The strongly structural planting scheme means that the gardens do not follow a traditional spring flourish, but have an all-season interest. The garden has an impressive collection of plants and specialises in rare and unusual succulent varieties. I was awestruck by the giant Australian grass tree with its gnarly black trunk. There were several. The land at Tremenheere Sculpture Gardens has a long history and was owned by the monks of St Michael's Mount until 1295. We can see St Michael's Island from the garden, but don't worry, we will in time go to visit the impressive gardens there. In 1295, Michael de Tremenheere, an established tenant farmer, bought the land and his family continued to own it until 1890. The last Tremenheere, Seymour Tremenheere, to whom the gardens are greatly indebted, planted the beech, oak, sweet chestnut and holly throughout the woods in approximately 1830. The garden also has a wonderful succulent nursery, which seems to specialise in aeoniums and semponiums, which are a cross between aeoniums and sempervivum. Not to be missed. We decided to visit a third garden which was relatively nearby, so we headed off to Trewidden Gardens, not to be confused with Trewidden Gardens. We hadn't gone far when we spotted an elderly man at the side of the road trying to flag down cars and dramatically holding up a help sign. We stopped, of course, and he explained he was trying to get to the hospital in Penzance. We agreed to give him a lift, although communication was difficult. He found our accents challenging. The hospital wasn't far and we delivered him safely before heading off to the garden. Trewidden Gardens is 15 acres or 6 hectares in size and dates from the mid-19th century. It was bought by the Bonython family in 1850 and remains in their hands until today. The garden has champion trees and 300 magnolias and camellias that lie beside a large tree fern dell. A champion tree is one which is either the tallest or the widest of its kind in the country. The tree fern dell is in an old abandoned open cast tin mine, which may have been one of the earliest in the duchy. You can still see remnants today. The tree fern dell is said to be one of the best tree fern collections in the Northern Hemisphere. Trewidden House and Gardens have featured in many films and productions featuring quintessential Cornish manor houses. Friday was very exciting as the plan was to visit Trebah Garden, arguably one of the top 3 Cornwall gardens. Trebah is 28 acres or 11 hectares and dates from the late 1830s. The Fox family, who had a very successful shipping business, created the garden and from the late 1830s began work to prepare Trebah for the arrival of the first collections of plants. In the fields on either side of the valley, Charles Fox planted hundreds of shelter belt trees, many of which survive today. Today, the garden has 8 champion trees. Over time, the garden was stocked with exotic plants, many of which had never been grown in Britain before. The fields on either side of the valley became known as the Himalayan or tropical ravine, and today it's an amazing sight. From above, the layers and the extent of planting are apparent. The view completely took my breath away. From palm trees to bananas to tetrapanics to large-leafed rhodos, and all with a backdrop of deciduous and evergreen shelter belt trees. A lot of the trees were difficult to make out from above because we're not used to seeing such large specimens and certainly not used to seeing them from above. While the champion Chusan palm, standing at 14.75 metres, was easy enough to identify, other plants were not. The Chusan, by the way, is approximately 150 years old and may even be from the earliest distribution of this palm in the British Isles. One plant completely mystified me with its softly bending fronds, appearing almost like a palm tree from above. It wasn't until I got down into the valley that I could identify it as a bamboo, an absolutely enormous bamboo. From above, there was no evidence of the bamboo canes at all, and yes, you can go right down into the ravine. The whole garden is laid out so cleverly that you mostly cannot see visitors on the paths at the bottom of the ravine when you're up above. The Himalayan ravine is amazing. It is otherworldly and goes far beyond anything you might expect in a mere garden. It is, in fact, unfair to apply the label of garden to such a stunning and extensive creation. While the Himalayan ravine just on its own is way enough to recommend Trebah Garden, it's not the only thing to see. At the entrance, there is a newly created courtyard garden. This is the first thing you see on your way into Trebah. The courtyard garden is joyous and bursting with colour. This is quite unusual for Cornwall, as the cloudy climate makes the growing of annuals or even roses more challenging, and a majority of gardens focus on subtropical leafy green plants rather than trying for the more traditional and colourful herbaceous or mixed borders. I loved the courtyard garden with its clean lines and a fusion of bright colours. It reminded me of many places I had seen in the north of France. I could in fact talk for a long time about Trebah Garden, but there are just 2 more areas that I really must mention. At the very end of the garden, there's a beach. You can swim there if you want to. This beach has important historical significance as it was the point from which US soldiers embarked for the World War II D-Day landing. On the 1st of June 1944, a regiment of 7,500 men of the 29th US Infantry Division embarked from Trebah Beach, landing on Omaha Beach in Normandy. There's a memorial on the beach to the many of those poor souls that lost their lives. Finally, I must mention Trebah's most iconic view. I visited in August, which meant the hydrangeas were in flower. 2 acres of hydrangeas, about a hectare, border the banks of Mallard Pond, creating a wall of colour in the late summer months. The hydrangeas at Trebah were planted in 1949 and the cut blooms used to be sent to Covent Garden Flower Market to raise income for the garden. The plants continue to bloom beautifully every year thanks to the hand pruning that gardeners carry out in February. It takes them about 3 weeks to complete the pruning, and I thought it was bad in my own garden. The flower heads are huge and are mostly a vibrant light blue from Trebah's rich acidic soil. In autumn, Hydrangea Valley casts clouds of china blue and soft white. The next garden on our list came recommended by the owner of Lamorran Garden. It also ranks as one of the great gardens of Cornwall. Bonython Estate Gardens dates from 1999 when the current owners bought it and started the garden, and it's 20 acres or 8 hectares in size. We entered the gardens via the courtyard and wandered through the formal kitchen garden. This walled garden section displays very classic symmetry and tastefully designed herbaceous borders. The herbaceous borders are lined with alliums, catmint and carefully selected varieties that enhance blue, purple, yellow and white colour themes. Many plants are scented, the aroma and look giving a Mediterranean feel. I spotted several rare plants here, big clumps of Roscoa gingers and one border containing the palm leaf begonia and a Robinson Crusoe cabbage tree. We were the only people present in the garden, and before long I began to feel like an intruder, that I'd trespassed into some beautiful private area where I shouldn't be. On the other side of the walled garden, the view suddenly and unexpectedly unfolded across an orchard of Cornish apple trees, expansive lawns, woodlands to the left and enormous bodies of water at some distance away. It gave me a kind of Alice in Wonderland effect, with the enclosed walled garden contrasting so markedly to the expanses of land on the other side. Just outside the walled garden was a thatched summer house where drinks and cakes could be purchased via an honesty box. The summer house had been created from a traditional disused stony bothy that had collapsed elsewhere and had been moved here. A gardener passed by at a distance on a tractor. I waved. He waved back and he continued on his way. The 3 lakes also provide plenty to see with their hot colour palette, created by swathes of largely South African plants, such as restios, tender plectranthus, tree ferns and bamboos. Bonython Gardens was imbued with an enormous sense of calm and tranquility. Back at the summer house, the head gardener strolled up and sat down with us for a lovely chat about the garden, the plants, the family, his connection with Irish gardeners and living and gardening in Cornwall. It was a wonderful end to day 3 of our Cornish visit. On Saturday, I booked a visit to the Lost Gardens of Heligan. This garden is among the top 3 of Cornish gardens. The gardens were created by members of the Cornish Tremaine family from the mid-18th century to the beginning of the 20th century, although the land had been in the family since the 16th century. Unfortunately, the gardens fell into ruin and were lost during the First World War and were then restored only in the 1990s. The gardens are 200 acres in size, that's 81 hectares. The name Heligan is derived from the Cornish word for willow tree. The thing I really loved about Heligan was its educational value. The kitchen garden sections looked like illustrations from Beatrix Potter's books. I almost expected Peter Rabbit to come bouncing around the corner. Before the First World War, this large garden required the services of 22 gardeners to maintain it. But the war led to most English gardeners signing up, and sadly 16 of Heligan's 22 gardeners died at the war. By 1916, the garden was being looked after by only 8 men. Many gardening techniques and knowledge died with the gardeners of that time, and a prime example of this is the pineapple pit. Big houses in England used to pride themselves on their ability to produce the exotic pineapple, mostly to impress guests, I think. Heligan showcases Europe's last remaining pineapple pit. Rotting manure that needed to be monitored 24 hours a day warmed the pit. Here is where the junior gardener slept. It was his job to keep an eye on the pineapple pit during the night, making sure that it didn't overheat or cool down too much, and to maintain the temperature of the central trench. Renovated in 1993, the Heligan pineapple pit produced its first pineapple in 1997. The Heligan gardens are extensive, and I believe there's lots to see if you visit when the rhododendrons and camellias are in flower. Heligan is also famous for 2 iconic figures made from rocks and plants. They're known as the Mud Maid and the Giant's Head. The Hidden Valley Gardens were next on our list. This is billed as the most colourful summer garden in Cornwall. The garden is 3 acres in size, that's 1.2 hectares. It's along the lines of an informal cottage garden style with lots of herbaceous perennials. The best thing for me was the dahlia borders. Long, narrow grass paths are flanked on either side by beds of vibrant dahlias, laid out in a grid fashion. The colour was glorious. Sunday was the day I'd booked the Eden Project. The Eden Project is perhaps the best known Cornish garden, and it was certainly the place I was most excited about visiting beforehand. The Eden Project is 30 acres, that's 12 hectares. It has 2 enormous greenhouses containing different biomes. One biome is dedicated to tropical rainforest, and the second is a more temperate biome. The first shock was the price. A ticket for one person cost £38. That's a whopping €44 or $48. In fact, there was no such thing as a single visit ticket. The ticket was actually an annual pass, which has no value for people visiting from abroad. The entrance price to Eden was far higher than any of the other gardens I visited. But I felt I should visit anyway, having come this far. The rainforest biome holds many amazing specimens and plants. The problem is that there are practically no labels. The only plants reliably labelled were those that are edible or have commercial value. Imagine going to the trouble of growing Typhonidorum, for example, the amazing water aroid, and then not putting a label on it or writing about the accomplishment. It seemed to me that the original focus of the Eden Project had been to grow plants for horticulturalists. but that emphasis had shifted over time and had changed to catering for families. If you look at the Eden Project website, the top 5 things to see in the rainforest biome are: number 1, the wobbly bridge; 2, the waterfall; 3, the partridges roaming free; 4, the traditional Malaysian house; and 5, the source of chocolate. I must say that I saw this emphasis in many of the gardens I visited in Cornwall. The focus was on activities for children and the garden as a great place to walk your dog. But I guess gardens must do whatever it takes to pay their overheads. The second biome holds plants from the Mediterranean, California, South Africa and Western Australia. In fact, many of the plants housed here seem to be already growing successfully outdoors in the great gardens of Cornwall. The section that I really loved was the Australian one. There was a mass of colourful kangaroo paw, beautifully planted together and interspersed with the Australian grass tree, the one I'd seen already at Tremenheere Sculpture Garden. Here, however, the grass trees were in spike. I felt really lucky to see this amazing sight. On Monday, I'd booked for us to visit the garden on the tidal island of St. Michael's Mount. The island is linked to the mainland by a causeway passable between mid-tide and low water. We entered the island on foot. The same monks who founded Mont Saint-Michel in France originally built St. Michael's Mount. The island has a long and checkered history, and a visit to the castle is very interesting. The private gardens on St. Michael's Mount were built in 1887 for a family of 11. They're very small and very vertical, designed to be seen from above as well as from within. The view from the castle battlements shows off some of their beauty. The paths are steep and the terraces narrow. Maintenance must be a nightmare because of the inevitable wear and tear from so many pairs of visitor feet on the grass. The planting was beautiful, with several blemishless and large specimens of Aloe polyphylla and Aeonium, Puya, Agave, Agapanthus and Restio. I loved the small rectangular white garden and really got a sense that this was a garden built for a family. It felt personal and intimate in a way that the Minack Theatre had not. Because of the steps and terracing and the exposed site, many comparisons could be made with the Minack Theatre, but of the two, St. Michael's Mount was my favourite. Can you see from this photo how the causeway is flooding now, although there are still some hardy people wading out to the island? We decided to stay dry and took the boat back to the mainland. The last garden I visited was Trengwainton Garden. Trengwainton is full of plants brought by the 1920s plant collectors to England. The name comes from the Cornish language Gwenten, meaning springtime, and I believe the garden is fabulous with rhododendrons in spring. The garden was donated by the Bonython family, the same family associated with Trewidden, to the National Trust in 1961. I'm afraid that I cannot tell you much about this garden as I was too tired to give it a fair chance, so I think it best that I say no more about it. On the last day of my visit in Cornwall, I visited a few nurseries and garden centres and lamented the ones that had gotten away. It hadn't been possible to visit the fabulous island garden of Tresco on the Scilly Isles without paying an absolute king's ransom. You may recall my video interview with young horticulturalist Eileen Gann earlier this year when she talked about her apprenticeship at Tresco. It had certainly whetted my appetite, but I didn't get there. I guess I'll have to go back. And this brings me to the end of this video about the 11 Cornish gardens that I visited last summer. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it has provided information for anyone planning a trip and inspiration for those who can't. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you on the next video. Bye!